Daniel Neuhauser is a senior political reporter for Vice News. He joins me now from Washington. Welcome, Daniel. Great to have you with us.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Other 2020 Democrats have expressed their anger at Israel's ban on Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. Their criticism of Israel has divided Democrats in the past. Is this issue something voters want to hear about from candidates?
You know, I think it's too early to tell for sure. This only happened today. I don't think voters have really had much of a chance to sound off yet. But I will say foreign policy generally tends to take a back seat to domestic policy. Look at what happened in the debates, the last two rounds of debates. Foreign policy was talked about very little. Israel policy doesn't seem to animate voters all that much. And I'm not sure that that either Tlaib or Omar have a national profile enough to dominate these kinds of contests. And I will say that the president seems to want exactly to change that. He wants Omar and Tlaib to be, as he calls them, the face of the Democratic Party. Why? Because he thinks that there's a chance for him to capitalize on that politically.
Right. He thinks that's a successful move. Now, you know, one presidential candidate we won't be hearing from anymore is former Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper. He announced he will not be continuing his bid for the nomination, but he did leave open a possible Senate run. Let's listen.
People want to know what comes next for me. I've heard from so many Coloradans who want me to run for the United States Senate. They remind me how much is at stake for our country and our state. I intend to give that some serious thought. I've been a geologist, a small businessman, a mayor, a governor, a candidate for President of the United States. At each step, I've always looked forward with hope, and I always will.
So is a Senate run the next likely step for Hickenlooper?
Well, I don't know. You know, usually if I sit on a stoop with an American flag in the background and soft music playing, I have no political ambitions whatsoever. It seems pretty clear that something's in the works here, and why not? He was polling at about 1% nationally in the presidential race. It was clearly not going anywhere. He wasn't raising money. He was not going to be on the next debate stage, but he remains pretty popular in Colorado. And you got to remember, the thing about Colorado is, you know, about a third of the voters are unaffiliated. So the same message that was failing him in the presidential run may actually be successful in the state run, which is a centrist message, talking to both sides, trying to be inclusive, not trying to be overly partisan. It seems pretty likely that he's going to jump in. And let's not forget that he remains highly rated. Somewhere between 40 to 60% of the Democratic primary electorate would support him over the other two people who have considered the run so far.
Right. And so while Hickenlooper ends his presidential bid, Beto O'Rourke is relaunching his own campaign. He took a 2-week hiatus to stay with his hometown of El Paso, Texas, after that mass shooting that left 22 people dead. This morning, he said he has a revamped strategy. So what is it, and how does it set him apart from the other candidates?
Well, let me quote Speaker Pelosi here, who when there's a young candidate thinking about running for the House, she sits him down and she says, "Find your why." Beto O'Rourke seemed to have sort of lost his why over the last couple of months. You know, there's already a sort of centrist candidate. There's already a likable, electable candidate in Joe Biden, and all the sort of lanes seem to be taken. Now he has experienced this incredible personal trauma in his hometown. There is no doubt that he's being sincere in how he's talking about this. He has been crying. He has been cursing. And his campaign seems intent to let him off the hook. Let Beto be Beto is something that you've heard a lot coming out of the campaign now. He's now going to try to go to non-traditional places where he can focus in on what he says is Trump's racism and the kind of rhetoric coming out of the White House and the administration that causes violence, like what we saw in El Paso, where a young man targeted Latinos specifically because they are Latino. And we'll see if he can turn it around. The question obviously is going to be, well, is that going to work? Is it already too late for him? A lot of people in the primary seem to have made up their minds to a certain degree, but there's still a lot of road out there in front of the candidates. This might be a strategy that could gain him some traction.
He certainly seems re-energized. He also addressed the idea of running for Senate in this morning's speech. Here's what he had to say about that.
I tell you, there's some part of me, and there's a big part of me, that wants to stay here and be with my family and be with my community. I love El Paso. There have even been some who've suggested that I stay in Texas and run for Senate. But that would not be good enough for this community. That would not be good enough for El Paso. That would not be good enough for this country. We must take the fight directly to the source of this problem, that person who has caused this pain and placed this country in this moment of peril, and that is Donald Trump.
You know, of course, we will all recall that O'Rourke nearly unseated Senator Ted Cruz back in 2018. So does it appear by what we just heard him say that it is the White House or bust for him, or is he leaving that Senate run door open just a bit?
Yeah, I mean, it didn't sound like it from what I heard, but, you know, this can change. These things can always change. Now, the thing about the Senate run is there's already about a handful of people in the race. And if he came back to Texas and said, OK, I've changed my mind, I'm going to run, it might not look great that he's kind of elbowing out of the way several more junior female candidates who have already announced their interest in the Senate seat. You also got to remember that John Cornyn is considered maybe a bit of a tougher fight than Ted Cruz, who is generally somewhat disliked among Republicans even. So there's no guarantee that he does any better or wins if he jumps back into that race. And you've got to remember that a vice presidential candidacy, even if he doesn't make it all the way to the top of the ticket, also remains an option for any candidate who wants to try to flip Texas.
Sure.
If Democrats flip Texas, that is game over. There's really no way that a Republican can win.
Sure, that's a very good point. All right, so former Georgia gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams also declined to bid for president earlier this week, choosing instead to focus on her voting rights initiative. But the New York Times asked Abrams if she'd be interested in a candidate if a candidate asked her to be their vice president. In response, she said, "I would be honored to be considered by any nominee, but my responsibility is to focus on the primary. And that means using the primary as an opportunity to build the apparatus to fight voter suppression." Abrams also declined to make any endorsements in the primary. But will candidates be clamoring to get Abrams on their side?
Will they be? I mean, they already have. Before the campaign even really heated up, there were stories being floated about Joe Biden trying to announce right off the bat a ticket with Stacey Abrams and sort of elbow out everybody else in the campaign trail. I think she's an incredibly attractive candidate for any Democrat who wants to win the presidency. First of all, you can't discount the demographics here. African-American women have been the most loyal Democratic voters of any constituency, and there's been a desire to try to include them not just in the policy-making decisions, but at the table. So she fits that certainly. She's a great speaker. She has an inspiring message, and she just barely lost statewide in Georgia, which is stunning for a Democrat. That might give Democrats some kind of an entree into the South, where they really haven't won all that much in recent years.
All right, Daniel Neuhauser from Vice, thank you so much for joining us.
Anytime.